If you're of my age or a little older, you'll probably remember most of Hollywood's timeless classics during the 1980s and 1990s. And if you were a little too young for the 80s era, quite likely you would have watched most of these massive blockbuster films growing up in the 90s, either renting them from a video shop or watching them on TV at Christmas. Yes, the film industry was once booming, producing films actually worth watching. Trust me, I remember most of it. It really did happen, and films were actually worth watching back then. Literally, classic after classic was produced. Whereas today, you'll likely see a couple of half-decent films per year, if that, and then forget about their existence soon after. The 80s and 90s had films that are still remembered, and were so good that franchises was born, which in some cases continue to be a thing today, and of course in some cases have actually outdone their welcome at this point. On many occasions, particular computer game companies would obtain licenses from film studios and have their developers create games based on the film that they have just received a licensing for. Ocean Software would be a good example. That Manchester-based Ocean Software had licensing for a ridiculous amount of film game tie-ins, although some of their 8-bit computer games based on films were fairly bad. Commodore 64's Highlander and Cobra, for example, say no more, although they actually did produce some superb games too. Advertising for these massive blockbuster films coming to home computer or console was a fairly standard thing to see once. Those advertisements in gaming magazines made you believe that you were somehow part of the film, and kids being kids would love the idea of shooting down baddies in games, playing with the coolest action stars of the day on their TV screen or monitor. It was a nice money making generator, and these software houses exploited it, many times with kids being very disappointed, that is. Of course, not all film to game tie-ins were that bad though, and many in fact were actually decent games in their own right. So today we are pushing nonsense titles like The Running Man aside and exploring 10 of the very best film to game tie-ins. Nine years after the release of the first Terminator film appearing, and at that point with Terminator 2 Judgment Day as its sequel, the Sega Mega CD had one of the best, if not the best, Terminator games around at that point. Sure, there was a Mega Drive and Sega Genesis version where we had a very short game just like the Sega Master System's version. I actually remember finishing it once as a kid in around 15 minutes, it really was that short. And also, let's not forget that the Super NES also had its own version, but was slated on its release for many reasons. Now, as great as the Mega Drive game or Sega Genesis game was, especially the music, the Sega Mega CD game blew it apart literally. Likely one of the best Sega CD games ever made, and very likely one of the best run and gun games ever made. We have a much more expanded and fleshed out game with this Mega CD release, likely because the compact disc held more data, and hence why this game came with an absolutely amazing soundtrack too, and also cutscenes from the film. Sure, those cutscenes are terrible by today's standards, but full motion video or FMV was a fairly groundbreaking technology at the time and helped immerse the player into the game just that little more. So in this game we play as Kyle Reese, and for the first few stages we are playing it in the future of the year 2029, and of course we have all kinds of Skynet technology to destroy in the future, such as Terminators themselves and robot tanks. Eventually we end up in 1984, once finding a time machine, and the rest of the game is then, just like the film itself, set around protecting Sarah Connor from the Terminator, who is doing everything it can to kill her to prevent her unborn kids from being born, who's of course John Connor. The game itself is fast-paced, incredibly detailed, and very enjoyable to play. It's pretty much perfect in every way possible. If you have never played this version, then ditch the Mega Drive or Master System game and play this one. It will seriously blow you away. It's worth playing just for the music alone, absolutely incredible. Like I say, if you didn't want a Sega Mega CD back in the day, then this was likely a game you wanted one for. The developers made the most of the hardware and really pushed it with the Terminator. The The king of pop came to arcades in 1990 with Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. Of course, this was based on the 1988 film, the same name. Michael Jackson was a personal childhood favourite, and I still blast out Thriller and the Bad albums to date. So how on earth could Michael Jackson be in a computer game? Well, very simple. Michael Jackson was one of the biggest singers in the 1980s. That's undisputed. Kids adored him, and like myself, were seriously impressed with his dancing, besides the amazing music. The man is a legend in the pop world. So a Michael Jackson film comes along, which was kind of like two films in one, and I'd watch this a hell of a lot back in the day. And it was also a reasonable box office success too. A film like this and a massive star that kids loved, it was a no-brainer. Having a game with Michael Jackson in it was going to be a big moneymaker, and it worked. It also helped that Michael Jackson was a fan of games himself. So we of course have some very shoddy computer versions of Moonwalker by US Gold, and the Mega Drive as well as the Sega Master System had its own version of Moonwalker 2, which were superior to the US Gold games. But this is another version. This is the actual original arcade game, which sadly never got ported over to anything and remained as an arcade game to date. It was a big success of a game by Sega. Michael Jackson even helped Sega put this game together. Like I said, he was a gaming enthusiast. What we get with the arcade game is an isometric scrolling beat 'em up. We rescue kids, which are a part of the second segment of the film, and travel through iconic locations, mainly based on the film, such as Club 30 and Mr. Big's lair. We can use limited powers to moonwalk, in which everybody on screen dances and in turn destroys everything on screen at once. We even get to power up as a robot, just like in the film. We have Michael Jackson music throughout the game and samples of Michael Jackson's voice. There are some questionable stages in the game, such as the graveyards, which is obviously from Thriller, but as a game itself, it is superb, and it's very strange that the Sega Mega Drive at least didn't get this version, but a platformer instead, along with its 8-bit brothers version. Now, personally, I was never a big fan of Gremlins 2, the new batch, which released in 1990. It had some great moments, but in general, it wasn't a patch on the original 1984 classic. There were games produced for the original Gremlins film, such as Gremlins the Text Adventure for the ZX Spectrum, but Gremlins 2 had more games that covered more platforms. The computer versions were roughly the same game and was released for most of the 8-bit and 16-bit computers, such as the C64 and Atari ST. Toposoft developed these games and they were released by Elite for Europe. Strangely enough, Ocean Software was known to have most of the major film licenses for games back then, yet this Spanish developer got the rights from Hollywood to make the computer versions, which to be fair wasn't the greatest. They were fairly boring and very frustrating platformers, as of which some particular versions go down as some of the worst games. Then we have the Sunsoft Game Boy Nintendo Entertainment System games, a totally different kettle of fish. The Game Boy version is a side-scrolling platformer where we control Gizmo, which is a great game, but the real gem here was the NES version, which released in 1990. It's a top-down platforming shooter, which is also considered as one of the best NES games. You will undoubtedly be like myself and agree that goddamn this game is difficult. We control Gizmo shooting down all of the nasties, and it even includes random enemies like bouncing tomatoes. Not only is the soundtrack to this game amazing, it also has really nicely detailed animated cutscenes, which gives you a storyline too. There are 5 stages in total, and in each stage these comprise of 2 to 3 sub-stages. We also fight bosses at the end of each stage. We start the game using tomatoes as our weapon, but can collect new weapons in the game such as matchstick firing bows and paper clips. We can also buy life and energy from Mr. Wing when we enter a shop. You will likely find yourself, or would have found yourself, very annoyed when getting past a bunch of nasties just by fluke. To die seconds later and being respawned to have to try and do this all over again. Yes, this is an absolute gem of a game with a ridiculous level of difficulty. 1991 brought us a new Addams Family film, a major release in its day which updated the original 1960s American comedy series. I am sure you have seen it, but the film is more or less centered around the Addams family being conned into believing that Gomez's long-lost brother, Fester, has returned, when in actual fact it's an imposter acting to steal the Addams' hidden vault. A superb cast with Christopher Lloyd, who plays Fester, and Christina Ricci, who plays Wednesday, much better than the modern day actress, I think. The film itself had major issues during production, with script rewrites as well as budgeting issues. Anyways, to cut a long story short, I have always preferred the sequel, which was of course the Addams Family Values. But the film game tie-in for the original film was great. Ocean Software released pretty much all of the Western releases of the game in 1992, and NEC Icon released a version for the PC Engine or TurboGrafx CD, which was fairly atrocious. The Ocean releases were the best. The 8-bit computer versions wasn't so wonderful, specifically the Commodore 64 version. The noises that game made were horrendous. The best versions, without a doubt, was for the 16-bit systems, where it released for the Amiga, Atari ST, Mega Drive, and the version I am playing here, which is of course Super Nintendo, is a standard side-scrolling platformer where we play as Gomez. It's a fairly big game which gives us the ability to choose which levels to play to. We can walk around outside of the mansion to find hidden places and stages. We can even fly around outside too. The real fun is within the mansion itself though. This is largely where all of the stages are. Stages can be fairly long but are fun to play. If you love discovering hidden areas, this game contains plenty of them. The aim of the game is to take down 4 bosses and ultimately to rescue members of your family. It's got amazing music. The SNES version in particular plays really well too. It's not really much like the film, but the film itself was a daring task in the first place to make a game from it, and what we got from it was a superb platform with extreme difficulty level in many cases.
NYPD! Hey, don't let him get away.
1996 brought us Die Hard trilogy for PlayStation, and in 1997 was released for both Sega Saturn and Windows. Die Hard with a Vengeance, which was the third film at the time, had just released in 1995, and what a superb film it was at the time. A film that I remember seeing billboard posters for, trailers on TV. This was a big deal in its day. Although I just turned 13 in 1995, I waited to rent it from the local video shop and I enjoyed every minute of it. From Samuel L. Jackson's attitude to Jeremy Irons playing the baddie, and the opening scenes of the film, which showcases a busy city with Summer in the City being played, then a sudden explosion which turns the city into a nightmare. A typical and classic Bruce Willis action film, so it was quite likely that the release of such a big film demanded a game. But why just have a game for Die Hard with a Vengeance when you could have Die Hard, Die Harder, and Die Hard with a Vengeance all in one package? And that is exactly what Fox Interactive released, with Probe Entertainment developing for them. Each game in this package was very different from each other. I played this game to death back in the day and I loved every minute of it, and also the fact that one disc contained so much variety. The first game then was obviously centered around playing John McClane shooting down terrorists in Nakatomi Plaza in a third-person perspective, which was awesome. Picking up rifles and throwing grenades whilst listening to a typical 1990s beat was superb, whilst listening to voice samples. Definitely a challenging game the further you get as you made your way to the top of the plaza, disarming bombs and rescuing hostages. The second game on the disc, which was Die Hard 2 Die Harder, was an on-the-rails shooter in a similar vein to something like Time Crisis. I would likely have said that this was better than Time Crisis, but I could be alone there. Again, we are shooting down terrorists in the airport. Sure, it's not aged that well, but playing this on a real PlayStation with a CRT TV doesn't look as bad. Die Harder could be played with a light gun controller or mouse. We finally get to Die Hard with a Vengeance. Again, a totally different game, full stop. No shooting whatsoever. It's a case of driving around New York to disarm bombs, just like in the film, within a time limit. This particular game in the trilogy is likely the hardest and most frustrating out of them all. We do have some cool Samuel L. Jackson, or Zeus as he's known in the film, voice samples of this too. All in all, Die Hard trilogy was a big success in its day, and Probe's most successful release in terms of UK sales of this game. There was actually a Die Hard trilogy 2, subtitled Viva Las Vegas, which I wasn't particularly a fan of, and in terms of reviews, it was nowhere near as highly rated as this one. Absolutely, without a doubt, one of my personal favourite 1980s films. This is of course RoboCop, considered as one of the decade's most violent films, mixed with a fusion of science fiction in action with comedy elements. The original 1987 RoboCop film is nothing short of a masterpiece, a franchise so big that it spawned kids' toys as well as games. In the background of its success, many copycat films were appearing, mixing the whole cyborg and human hybrid scenario. Of course, none of them topped RoboCop. A very brief rundown of RoboCop: Alex Murphy, the main protagonist, is gunned down by a gang, and his then party use constructs a cyborg cop, all controlled by OCP, who controls the police. Detroit's outskirts has become infested with gangs, and RoboCop is designed to clear up whilst New Delta City is being built in the background. That utopian vision. I could go on and on about the complex and academic sides of this film, but let's stay focused here. There have been several RoboCop games for the original trilogy, as well as a very good first-person shooter, most recently known as Rogue City, which is of course light years ahead of that terrible 2003 game. We will skip all of the home computer and console versions and standalone games and go straight back to where it all began. This was the first RoboCop game in existence and was entirely based on the 1987 film. This Data East Arcade game released in 1988 and went down as an instant hit. It is considered as a running gun style game and is just pure class in every way. From the sound effects used to imitate RoboCop's gun, the sound of Ed 209 talking at RoboCop requesting for him to put down his weapons, the game is pure perfection. Not to say that the home conversions of this game wasn't great, they were just different, although one of them wasn't even playable after a few stages in. The authentic RoboCop experience is right here with music from the film, that dirty and grimy look of the stages, and the awesome bonus stages where we're looking through RoboCop's visor at shooting ranges in the police station. Truly one of the best arcades game released in the 1980s, although some of the home conversions of this game were okay. They weren't strictly arcade conversions as such, but kind of their own thing. Bruce Willis had his fair share of appearing in film to game tie-ins many moons ago. This is Hudson Hawk, an extremely obscure and very quirky film from 1991. It was considered as an action comedy. It is a little out there, but that's not a bad thing. I mean, so what if Bruce Willis suddenly begins singing whilst he attempts to steal from museums, whilst using a kid's skateboard to sneak past security? The entire film was a big leap from Bruce Willis's recent pure action star status that nobody could take seriously at the time with Die Hard. The best way to take Hudson Hawk is don't take it too seriously, but take it as a slapstick cartoon style film with surreal humour. So what is Hudson Hawk about? Well, Bruce Willis plays a cat burglar known as Eddie Hawkins. He has just been released from prison and meets up with an old friend. To skip lots of context, Eddie is then blackmailed into stealing priceless Renaissance artifacts of Leonardo da Vinci. Anyways, the game itself was highly praised at the time. It was distributed by Ocean Software in Europe, which dealt with every home computer version at the time. I personally owned and seriously loved the Commodore 64 version back in the day, while Sony ImageSoft released the NES and Game Boy versions for America. All of these roughly released around the same time of 1991. I have played every version of the game over the years and personally don't think there was actually a bad version of it. It is a platformer game with puzzle elements involved, and it is in every way as quirky as the film itself was. From dodging birds who poop on you, avoiding security alarms, and kids roaming around on bikes inside of museums, this game is very unique and also very challenging too. These days my preferred version is the Commodore Amiga version. It's colourful and uses that awesome gradient backdrop in the first stage of the game. Jumping does take a little practice, as when we do jump, Eddie will auto jump to the right or left, and so getting used to it is needed. Once you get past that, this really is a little bit of a hidden gem these days, with a variation of stages that are faithful to the extent of the film itself. Definitely one of Ocean Software's best releases for the home computers. The 90s had a thing about making trilogy games based on classic films, and this game was exceptionally good. It was also developed by Probe, who worked on Die Hard trilogy, and it released by Acclaim. This game was a huge success and particularly notable for its use of 3D motion capture technology, which was created by Acclaim's engineering team, which was Advanced Technologies Group. Alien Trilogy released initially on the PlayStation, which is what I once played it on, then released for the Sega Saturn, and there was also an MS-DOS version a few months later in 1996. At this point, Alien Resurrection, the fourth Alien film, had yet to be released, and so Alien Trilogy was set around the first three films. It works very differently from the Die Hard Trilogy game, where we cannot select a different game to play. The game borrows parts of the first three films and develops its own story from these. You play as Ripley, who is a Marine here, and she has travelled to LV-426 to investigate the loss of contact, and soon finds herself battling against facehuggers and xenomorphs. As you progress in the game, later stages become more obvious as they're based around a prison from the Alien 3 film. The game pretty much starts off like Aliens though, and has that action-packed feel to it, rather than the more story-driven original 1979 release. This is a game I would play endlessly back in the day on my PlayStation. At the time, first-person shooters was a fairly new idea, or rather games like this one stepping away from the generic Doom clones of the day, which got ridiculous after a while. This game is extremely atmospheric, and it's a type of game that I would freak out playing in my bedroom at night, whilst I was on my last bit of energy and being hunted down by several xenomorphs. Each mission gives us a layout of what we need to do prior to the mission starting. We also got maps to use when we do find them. The music is phenomenal and adds that atmosphere to the game, and the sounds of aliens and doors opening sounds incredible too, as most of these were actually sampled from the films themselves. It's one of those games that I have hoped for some kind of remaster over the years, but it hasn't happened yet. It's a fairly sized game which comprises of 30 levels and 3 bosses. Alien Resurrection had a game too, which released in the year 2000, but I always thought the Alien Trilogy game was so much better. Batmans were no stranger to have film game tie-ins. Some were great and some were atrociously bad. Batman and Robin was a disaster. Of course, we had an amazing game based on the original 1989 Batman film for the NES, and also some fairly good games by Ocean 2 for computers. The game of Batman Returns, though, are questionable, unless you are talking about Batman Returns for the Super Nintendo by Konami, possibly one of the Super Nintendo's best beat-em-ups ever made, and was praised on its release in 1993, and has been highly regarded over the years since as being one of the best games on this platform. Batman Returns works great as a game, and Konami did it a great justice too. We walk through all locations from the film, such as the snowy Gotham City, where we fight many Red Triangle clowns who are there to bring the place down. We see clowns that look like the clowns from the film, including clowns on stilts and even on motorbikes. The colour scheme used here is very clever. It's not overly bright like your average SNES game, but has a more dimmer and darker look about it to perfectly capture the Tim Burton look. Each scene in this game has a boss fight, and the first boss has Selina Kyle, aka Catwoman, captured just like in the film. It's a very faithful game in keeping the film's storyline intact, and features that dreary Danny Elfman music too. We truly have it all with this game. When people refer to beat-em-ups from the 16-bit era, they generally refer to the obvious candidates such as Streets of Rage or Final Fight. If you haven't played this game and enjoy beat-em-ups, seriously, this is one of the best film-to-game tie-ins around. Really, how could I have not included the most respected and best known film to game tie-ins ever made? Now, this is GoldenEye for N64. I am sure it needs no introduction. Not only was this Pierce Brosnan's first film released back in 1995, but it was also his best film too. A film that I watched at the cinema on its release with my family. An absolute cracking Bond film which took over from the Timothy Dalton era, The Living Daylights also being a superb Bond film. GoldenEye was a massive deal at the time of its release, to the point that it even had a sticker book, which I almost had a complete set for. We of course also had one of the best James Bond songs ever by Tina Turner, and we had a plethora of some of the best action scenes, such as James Bond riding around Russia in a tank complete with a statue planted on top of it, an awesome opening scene where Bond escapes from an army of Russians, speeds down a runway chasing a plane to escape, and so on. This film had it all and included some rather saucy and even kinky scenes with a particular enemy of James Bond. So why was this N64 exclusive so damn good? It was one of those early first-person shooter games that wasn't in a similar vein to Doom, as of which we know had plenty of clones in its time. This game by Rare brought N64 players a new type of experience of first-person shooting, with a storyline and also cutscenes which all worked so well, complete with missions that we would have to do per stage. The game itself very closely follows the film's narrative, to the point where we even go slightly back further to the film itself. The opening to the film just sees James Bond running towards the dam and bungee jumping off it. In this game we go back slightly further to what actually happened before that. We have all the obvious locations from the film, such as the runway, bunker stages, the archive. We even get to drive around Russia in the tank here. What really made this game shine was its multiplayer option, where up to 4 players could play together at the same time. I really don't need to say any more about this game. It released in 1997 and likely most Sega Saturn and PlayStation users wanted to buy an N64 for this game at the time. There was an enhanced version of this game in 2010 which featured Daniel Craig, which was a strange choice since clearly it was a Brosnan film. You can also play GoldenEye as of now if you're an Xbox Game Pass user. Let us know in the comments which game you liked most out of this list. Did you actually buy an N64 back in the day specifically to play GoldenEye? It's quite likely you did. But anyways, until next video comes, thanks for watching. Around a week back, I uploaded 10 of the very best film-to-game tie-ins, which comprised of a variety of different platforms, from the Sega CD up to the Super Nintendo. It was all there pretty much. I was going to make a part 2 in the same format, but I thought, you know what, let's skip home computers and consoles and get straight to the best versions, as well as film-to-game tie-ins, which to date still remain arcade exclusives after 20 plus years. And trust me, some of these arcade exclusives will make you wonder why they were never ported. It baffles many people to date with some of these games, it truly does. So today we are checking out 10 arcade games which were tied in with some of the biggest films of the 1980s as well as 1990s. There is one particular game here that, although the film was a mess and to date has a lot of criticism, the arcade game actually wasn't as bad as you might think. Well, certainly not the arcade version of it anyway. There are other games here where you would question if it was even like the film itself. In many cases, of course not, but any sign of action in a film, then of course it would become a game. Why? Because that was business and most children didn't mind spending mum and dad's money on shooting down aliens after all. We are going through several different genres of game in this video, from light gun rail shooters to beat 'em ups and shoot 'em ups, and of course have a little chat around each film the game is actually based on. Anyways, let's check out 10 of the very best arcade film to game tie-ins. I'll be honest with you, as much as I love old school Rambo films, I was never too keen with Rambo 3. My all-time favourite from the original trilogy easily goes to First Blood Part 2, which also had some memorable film game tie-ins that many people have fond memories of. So why did I choose a Rambo 3 game? Well, there were several different games for Rambo 3. My first Rambo game was actually Rambo 3 for the Commodore 64, which was great but fairly difficult. There was also Rambo 3 for the Sega Mega Drive, which was a mediocre game, and another one for the Sega Master System, which was also very different. But I think as far as arcade classics go, Rambo 3 the arcade game is very much underrated. If you have never seen this game before, it looks similar to games like Cable, only this game scrolls too, almost a hybrid of Operation Wolfen. So of course we have plenty of action in this game, in fact an obsessive amount of action in the game, even for a Stallone film game tie-in. The game loosely follows the plot of the film, but bear in mind this is an arcade game, and the idea is to take your money quickly and on to the next customer. So in-depth context of the film itself is kept to a very minimum, and we are presented to a couple of images from the film as well as the very basics of its plot. For those of you who have never watched Rambo 3, well, in a nutshell, Rambo needs to rescue his longtime friend and mentor, Colonel Sam Troutman, who had been captured by the Soviets. The theme and background set in Rambo 3 is a fictional Afghan-Soviet war, so John Rambo was happily content living amongst Thai Buddhists until the news is delivered to him. Before you know it, Rambo is at war fighting to rescue his friends. The game starts off as a side-scrolling and to some extent rail shooter. We can shoot at soldiers and blow up tanks. We are supplied to weapon crates when enemies drop them after we shoot them. We also take on bosses such as tanks and helicopters. Come level 2, we are then presented with a new type of stage where Rambo is running in the desert and shooting at oncoming enemies and tanks. It looks fairly nice for its release date of 1989. For some reason, this particular version was never actually ported to anything, so it's considered to be stuck in the arcade to date. Now, although RoboCop 2 the arcade game includes baddies and bosses, which are fairly random compared with the film, in other words, just randomly chucked in sprites just to make a game, this East Japanese arcade game, which released in 1991, isn't bad at all. If you have ever played any of the other RoboCop 2 games on either home computer or console, these were all very much fairly questionable games. The 8-bit computer versions were fairly bad. The Commodore 64 game in particular was pretty atrocious, and the Amiga and Atari ST versions, although a slight upgrade from the 8-bit games, by no means were any of these perfect. It also had a Nintendo Entertainment System game too, which wasn't fantastic. So as for the film itself, of course not a patch on the original 1980s masterpiece, but certainly miles better than the shocker which was a RoboCop 3. Let's be fair, if you're a RoboCop freak like myself, there is absolutely no denying that RoboCop's armor looks ridiculously metallic blue in this film. And yes, it is a little goofy too with a kid playing a villain in the film, but it's okay nevertheless. As for RoboCop 2 the arcade game, then it's a nice little scrolling running gun game where we can fire in both directions and even jump, which is strange as I never recall RoboCop jumping, but I could be wrong, and given it's a game then sure, let's give RoboCop the ability to jump. We travel to new mission, which gives it the Batman Returns Mega CD look. I highly recommend this game, and let's not forget the original arcade game of RoboCop 2. That game was just phenomenal. Alien 3 wasn't the best of the original Alien trilogy due to script changes and bad looking puppets mixed with fairly questionable CGI. The film takes on immediately from Aliens and crash lands Ripley's escape pod onto a penal colony with an alien organism on board with her. Although Alien 3 underperformed in its day compared with the previous two films, it did do fairly well over the years and has gained its own cult following who gives it a little more appreciation nowadays. Alien 3 obviously had film-to-game tie-ins, largely all the same in gameplay, some better versions than others. The Sega Mega Drive version was probably my favourite back in the day. Now, sadly, this amazing light gun rail shooter known as Alien 3 The Gun never actually made it outside of the arcade, and it's truly baffling in hindsight. It's probably one of the best rail shooters around, and this could easily been ported to the PlayStation or Sega Saturn or even both. So is it similar to the film? Well, no it really isn't. My disinterest in Alien 3, the film that is the lack of action. Alien 3 The Gun on the other hand is a different kettle of fish. It's more like playing Aliens rail shooter game rather than Alien 3. The amount of facehuggers and xenomorphs here are a tad bit overboard, and I don't even recall Ripley outside of the colony shooting down hordes of xenomorphs either. I don't remember rusty looking robots attacking Ripley either, come to think of it. But it is a film to game tie-in nevertheless. Whether or not it's like the film, this is a superb game that released in 1993 by Sega, around a year after the film released. There are many amazing games which never got ported to home consoles or home computers like this one, and it truly baffles many people. I would imagine it was some kind of licensing legality issues between Hollywood and Sega, but I'm not sure that anybody really knows for sure. I think Hook, the arcade game, is just proof that if anything was popular enough in the 80s and even 90s, then guaranteed somebody would obtain a license and produce a game for it. Hook had many different versions on multiple platforms, but this particular game stayed in the arcade. This beat-em-up was produced by IREM and released in 1992, where home computers and consoles had mainly 2D platforming games, and some went for the Monkey Island style with Hook on the Amiga. This arcade game was literally on its own, and it's a real shame. We get to control 4 of the main characters from the film and walk through levels punching and kicking things in the environment in order to aid us to defeat the baddies. As for the film itself, this was a big deal in its day, but admittedly not one of my personal favourites. The arcade game though is actually pretty damn good. Now whoever thought that Peter Pan could seriously kick ass with his friends? If you're at the age to remember the launch of Jurassic Park, you will remember the major hype around it at the time of its release back in 1993. This film was probably one of the biggest and most talked about in the early 1990s due to its first of a kind mega impressive CGI, which still holds up fairly well to date. Jurassic Park had many different versions for different platforms, from the top-down and pseudo 3D hybrid game for the Super Nintendo, the platforming game for the Sega Mega Drive, and a totally different game for the 3DO. This rail shooter for the arcade was absolutely superb. It's another one of those cases of never being ported to console or computer at the time, where this wouldn't have looked at a place on either the PlayStation or Sega Saturn, or even both. Sega released this epic shooter in 1994. It went on to subsequently produce arcade sequels for The Lost World, as well as Jurassic Park 3. As for this game itself, it's highly likely handled better with 2 players rather than just one. Jurassic Park will constantly bombard you with dinosaurs left, right and centre. The environments and gameplay world in this game were super impressive for a game of this era. Jurassic Park the Arcades game was the first game in this genre to include 3D environments too. It was also produced using the Sega System 32 board, which was Sega's last board in its Super Scaler series. The early 90s was notorious for taking games and turning them into films. Most of all was either trashed at the time or trashed by critics later on in life. It started with the Super Mario Bros. Film, which I personally think is a decent film, given the limited lore of Super Mario Bros. To work with at that point. We also had a Double Dragon film, which I rented on release, super cheesy, but a fun film nevertheless. Then we had Street Fighter the movie. Now, if you ever wanted to see Kylie Minogue in a Cammy outfit, then this was your golden opportunity. Street Fighter the movie was a very hyped up film in its day when it released back in '95. There was toys based on it too, which I'm fairly sure I had a couple of, although at this point I was in that awkward transition of being a kid and moving on to my teenage years. Most famously, this arcade game based on the film used digitized images, and of course certain developers and companies would use this at this time, as the thought of this look was the future of gaming. Sadly, it wasn't. A great idea for the time though, to give games a little more realism. Now, just like the film itself, this arcade game, which actually got ported to PlayStation and Sega Saturn, received a fair amount of bad press at the time, and I am sure it's one of those games that Capcom would likely want to forget about releasing in 1995. But really, was it that bad? I actually like to go against reused reviews, and I'm actually going to say that this beat 'em up isn't bad at all. It's certainly not the worst of its kind to use digital photography to create this look. It's actually a decent beat 'em up. Okay, so nowhere near on par with Street Fighter 2, but yeah, if you have never played this one, give it a go. I'll even give you a hint. Playing Kyle or M. Bison are two of the best characters to play as in this game. Yes, I have already showcased Alien 3, but this is Aliens, the second film in the trilogy at this point, and besides this 1990 Konami game, it was widely known to be one of Konami's best games in the run and gun genre, and yes, I would concur. Aliens is pretty damn fun to play. We get to play as either Ripley or Corporal Hicks, starting the game with a fairly basic smart gun, although as we play through the game, we can pick up new weapons which range from grenade launchers as well as flamethrowers. Interestingly, this game changes perspectives. For example, we go from playing a typical looking run and gun side-scrolling game and then onto a third-person rail shooter, which is just as nicely designed as the main body of the game itself. Strangely enough, when this game released in 1990, Aliens as in the film was actually 4 years old at this point. Most of these film to game tie-ins were generally put out within the same time as the release of the film itself. But regardless of years, this game is a good one for sure. It loosely follows the plot of Aliens, and we do get some brief narrative, but again, this is an arcade game, and so there isn't really a heavy emphasis on storyline as such. Konami also released another famous arcade game in this same year of 1990, which was of course Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Aliens was actually Konami's second best-selling arcade game of the same year. Although I don't personally remember Aliens being in the arcade, I certainly played Turtles religiously back then in the arcade. Sadly, like many other games in this video, this arcade game never got ported to anything, although many 8-bit home computers had a game known as Aliens the computer game, although not the same as the arcade game by any means. The Commodore 64's American version of Aliens was also very good, and well worth checking out the American version of that. Very likely one of the most underrated games in this video. This is Willow. It's based on the high fantasy cult classic from 1988 by Ron Howard, with a fairly young Warwick Davis, who was previously known for his early work in Star Wars and also David Bower's Labyrinth too. We also have a fairly young Val Kilmer too in this film, prior to his role as Jim Morrison, as well as being Batman a little later on. So why is this game underrated? Well, it's very simple. Nobody talks about it with old school memorable arcade games. It's of course considered as a run and gun platforming game, but I mean this one is just so much fun. We start as playing as Willow, shooting down enemies in the game, jumping up and down platforms whilst taking in the beautiful looking pixelated scenery. We can use shops to buy upgrades and health too, which is always a bonus, and we get to take down bosses which are inspired from the film. We can later in the game play as different characters from the film, such as Val Kilmer's character, and use a sword here to bash through the enemies. Willow, the game released by Capcom in 1989, they also released a version for the Nintendo Entertainment System, although that was a very different game and was considered as an RPG. If you have not played Willow, I seriously urge you to, especially if you're a complete sucker for colourful platforming games like myself. This game isn't the most lengthiest game around, it only comprises of just 6 stages, but playing this with 2 very awesome characters makes up for this entirely. James Cameron gave us some of the best films in the 90s and seemed very fond in particular of having Arnold Schwarzenegger in his action films. True Lies was also an amazing Cameron film, which also starred Jamie Lee Curtis in that unforgettable exotic dance scene. But as far as Cameron in arcade games went, we got the phenomenal Terminator 2 Judgment Day, or simply just known as T2, one of the best light gun rail shooters of the early 90s without a doubt. Midway managed to grab the license for what was going to be one of the 90s biggest films ever, and I am sure Midway never regretted doing this. This rail shooter was so popular that much later on, Arcade 1UP produced a smaller scale replica cabinet, which was actually released in 2021. Terminator 2 games were a little all over the place though in general. The arcade game had various ports which I actually covered in my arcade port series some time back, but Terminator 2 had different games released. For example, one of the first games for the Super Nintendo that I played in the early 90s was Terminator 2 Judgment Day by LJN. Now, although many people criticised that game, I thought it wasn't too bad. The Nintendo Entertainment System also had a completely different version too. As for the Commodore 64, again a completely different game altogether, and that's not even to mention the original Game Boy's version of Terminator 2. So, as for this arcade game, it is again loosely based around the film in which we are protecting John Connor, leader of the human resistance, as well as his mum Sarah Connor from the T-1000. The game is a tough one and likely snatched plenty of your coins back in the day. We play as a T-800 cyborg and can play 2 players simultaneously. There are 7 stages in this game, 4 of which are set in the future in 2029 and features one particular stage which is pure hell for many, protecting John Connor as he drives through the wastelands of the future. I am telling you, this stage was pure hell. The remaining stages are set in the present day, which at the time was of course the 90s. John Connor's childhood, that is. Shooting down endoskeletons and everything else in this game is just pure fun. It even has some really awesome sound samples from the film itself.
Terminated. Let's go.
Luke, trust me.
Really, it would have been rude not to include what is considered as one of the greatest arcade games ever released. This is the original 1983 Atari Star Wars game. This game is so great that it even released in the same year that I was born. If you are unfamiliar with the style of this game, you will see what is known as 3D color vector graphics. Those bright green lines and lines of other colors which this game uses were nothing short of wizardry for a 1983 release, and it has a unique look that I still think looks really nice today. Those coloured lines truly pop out on OLED screens today in particular. There are 3 main sequences for each difficulty level in this game, which of course get more difficult as you go through the game. We begin the game by shooting down TIE fighters in space, we then proceed towards the Death Star and fly through its surface, and then we go on to the final trench run. If all this wasn't enough to blow your mind in 1983, then the voice and music in this 1983 1993 game will definitely blow you away without a doubt. Of course, this game had a ridiculous amount of home computer and console ports during the 1980s, ranging from the BBC Micro, Commodore 64, and even the Atari 2600. But really, the true experience of this epic arcades game is the original without a doubt. And that's it for taking a look at all the best arcade film to game tie-ins today. If you've not seen part 1 of this video, then I'm going to link that in the comments section so you can watch that. And again, as always, comment in the comments section and let us know which one of these you like the most. Anyways, until next time, thanks for watching.
R2 join increase the power.
Stay in attack formation.
It's been a little while since I uploaded the last Best of Movie Game Tie-ins video, so here we are. This is officially part 3 of the best games which are based on films. The worst games that I uploaded just the other day prompted me to do this one. Playing some of those titles was just absolutely horrendous, but here we are, 10 more of the best games, each of which were actually a lot of fun to play in the making of this video. This part is going to feature several quality games that you might not be expecting to see, or just completely forgotten about, as some of the releases in this video were released at times when particular platforms were fading at popularity, as new generations of consoles were just about to hit the world. We got everything in this video from James Cameron blockbusters to films that were notoriously bad but just happened to have a decent game. Like I say, this is part 3, and so if there is a game I haven't included in this part, then it is likely already been done in a previous installment. But a couple of people will bypass this introduction and ask anyways. I've gotten used to this over time. It's just one of those things that us content creators get used to on YouTube. Anyways, this is the very best movie to game tie-in games part 3. I'll also link the previous parts in the comments section if you have missed them and want to catch up as to where we are. So anyways, without further hesitation, let's begin. The last game you was expecting to see in the best film game tie-ins video is Back to the Future, and that's not really surprising. As I discussed in my worst film game tie-ins video recently, Back to the Future had some absolutely horrific games for the trilogy of films, and I think everybody is pretty much aware of that at this point. But here we have a strange oddity of a game known as Super Back to the Future 2, which was a Japanese exclusive, which released by Toshiba EMI in 1993. Which of course is a little strange considering that by 1993 the third film had released. So why specifically make a film game tie-in for Back to the Future Part 2? Possibly because Back to the Future 2 had the best look about it, and by using an art form known as Super Deformed, could provide us with that very cutesy, almost anime look about it. And I personally think it looks good rather than making it look realistic with digital imagery, which was fairly popular technology at the time of this game's release. Super Back to the Future 2 differs tremendously from any Western attempt, and Back to the Future in this game is actually a fun game to play. Yes, it suffers with frame drops, but if you can forgive this occasional slowdown, it's a seriously underrated game. It was, of course, criticised at the time of its release for this issue, as well as controls being compared with something like Bubsy, but if you get a handle on the controls, you can have a lot of fun with this game. Let me give you a tip. Hold down the speed up button whilst making Marty jump on his hoverboard. This makes jumping much easier. It's a totally bizarre concept of a game, and especially adding that anime look too, but it is such fun, and the music and even opening sequence of the DeLorean flying into the screen looks awesome. We even get to battle Biff in the Club 80s bar here too, whilst outside we can jump on robots and police officers who are randomly shooting at us. Give this game a try, especially if you have never heard of this version before and always felt cheated back in the day for having an awful Western version of Back to the Future. My absolute favourite Ghostbusters film of all time, and let's just pretend for a minute that that pitiful 2016 nonsense never happened, and so it simply doesn't count. So there. This is Ghostbusters 2, and it happens to be the first film I ever watched in the cinema when it released back in 1989. And of course, if you were a kid throughout the early 1980s and going into the 90s, Ghostbusters was a major deal for kids back then. Although the franchise is happily keeping afloat in recent years with Afterlife and Frozen Empire, which are both really good films in their own right. I also had 3 Commodore 64 Ghostbusters games growing up, 2 of which were based on the films, as well as the real Ghostbusters. Do you remember that cartoon? I got to say that the original game didn't appeal to me much, the sequel was ridiculously hard, and the real Ghostbusters game was just, well, meh. So here we have new Ghostbusters 2 on the NES. To my understanding, this was a PAL exclusive. It's kind of confusing because there was also another Ghostbusters 2 game on NES, which was very different to this game that you were watching. But by far, this new Ghostbusters 2 game is without a doubt the best one. It's got a lot of charm to it, and it also uses that all cutesy Nintendo style sprite design. The game itself is fairly faithful to the film. For example, we start off the game by fighting through the courthouse and navigating around different rooms following arrows of where to go. Before the game begins, we need to select our main character, in which case I selected Peter Venkman, who I am moving around in the game as well as using the proton beam, whereas I also need to select a second member of the Ghostbusters, which I chose Egon, who acts as the Ghostbuster who opens the ghost trap to suck in the ghosts. We can even play as Lewis in this game. Sure, he wasn't actually a Ghostbuster as such, but he at least wore the uniform at the end of the film and thought he truly saved the day whilst the Ghostbusters are battling it out against evil Vigo. We get to fight bosses in the game such as the Scoleri brothers. We even get to walk through the underground train system. Like I said, it's a very faithful and cute game to the film. This is a seriously fun game with some great sounding music from the film too, only an 8-bit chiptune version. This is the Terminator for Sega Mega Drive as well as Sega Genesis. Now, many will likely agree with me that this is an incredibly short game, but whilst it lasts, it's a superb run and gun game based around the 1984 film with the same name. Strangely enough, by the time this game was released in 1992, the film itself was at this point 8 years old, but Virgin Games hired Probe to develop this game regardless, and the end result was pretty damn good too. The game sadly only contains a few levels, but these are very challenging levels at times. We play as Kyle Reese and the game opens up in the future for the first stage, and then we arrive in the present day, of which was 1984 at the time of the film, where we must shoot down Terminators, punks as well as the police. The music for the first stage is beyond outstanding. You might have noticed on previous Mega Drive related videos on my channel that I often use it, literally because I love this tune. Now, in terms of difficulty level, we can go to options and change settings for this, but even on the easiest mode, this game can be pretty tough at times. Once we die, it's an instant game over. We actually get no continues or lives in this game, just a health bar that can drop rapidly at times. Of course, the Sega Mega CD had a version of the Terminator which was very different from this, and of which I covered in the first part of this series. But in my opinion, both of these were truly amazing games. Graphically, this Mega Drive release looks awesome with some nice moody colours and contrast used. This version of the Terminator also released on the Sega Master System as well as the Sega Game Gear, although this Mega Drive version I think was the best version of it altogether. Yes, I know what you're thinking. Out of all James Bond films, where is GoldenEye, and why is this third-person shooter taking its place? Well, to be honest, I was going to feature Tomorrow Never Dies, which was Pierce Brosnan's second James Bond film in the first part of this series. But of course, ultimately GoldenEye was the better game, as many would agree. Tomorrow Never Dies, I think, never had a fair chance of rating anywhere near as great as GoldenEye did, but that's not to say this isn't a decent game in its own right. Tomorrow Never Dies released as an exclusive for PlayStation and was never ported to anything else. It released by EA back in 1999. Many critics slammed this as a poor follow-up to GoldenEye, which I get, but let's be fair here, this game isn't or wasn't attempting to be GoldenEye by any means. For starters, Tomorrow Never Dies is an entirely different film and storyline to GoldenEye, which centres around Elliot Carver, a media mogul who engineers world events to initiate World War III, or at least attempt to. A far cry from the Soviet style of GoldenEye. So as for the game itself, it loosely follows the film, which features stages reminiscent from the film and even includes FMV cutscenes too, which helps the game follow the storyline of the film. Now admittedly, controlling bombs can initially take a little getting used to, but once mastering it, this really is an underrated game which I don't think ever received the praise that it really deserves. It's not perfect by any means, but for what it is, it's a decent shooter with some challenging stages. My only gripe with Tomorrow Never Dies for PlayStation is not featuring a playable stage where we jump off Elliot Carver's building like in the film. That scene was just awesome. Next up, we have the awesome Arnold Schwarzenegger and Jamie Lee Curtis 1994 action comedy film True Lies. And of course, this is by James Cameron, who at this point in time had already made his mark on Hollywood with notable films in the 80s such as Aliens, as well as a few years later, the phenomenal Terminator 2. Now, personally, I kind of always seen True Lies as Arnold's final decent action film before the quality went downhill. Eraser was his next big action film, and that film just didn't appeal much to me, but of course it was a damn sight better than Junior, which also released in 1994. So if you have never watched True Lies, one of my favourites as a kid, and I actually recently watched this, and I will say easily that this film aged perfectly. It just doesn't really look like a film from over 30 years back, and of course that's simply because it's a James Cameron film, and his films have always looked great through high production and high budget. So the film stars Arnold Schwarzenegger, who plays Harry, a spy taking on the whole James Bond-esque scenarios with his unsuspecting wife Helen, who is played by the awesome Jamie Lee Curtis, who has no idea he is actually a spy, simply because it's very top secret stuff more than likely. As the film progresses, Jamie Lee Curtis has an absolutely hilarious affair with Bill Paxton's character Simon, and when I mean hilarious, it really is hilarious as he cons her into believing he is some kind of undercover agent, but in reality, Simon is a second-hand car dealer and nothing else. Eventually, Harry and Helen become aware of each other's secret lives, and the film then leads into the kidnapping of their daughter by the terrorists. It's a generic action film with quirks, and it works really well. The game follows the film surprisingly well too. It's a top-down shooter which kind of reminds me of the Chaos Engine for the look it's got. Our first mission is to plant a modem in a certain room while shooting down enemies and avoid killing innocent people, and finding key codes of course to access new rooms. We can switch between weapons in the game, jump dive to avoid bullets, and it all works so well. It's a decent running gun game which isn't really talked about much. We even have still images from the film with storyline to keep the player in the loop. It's not particularly an easy game, and we only have normal and hard difficulty settings, here on the SNES version at least. It also released for the Mega Drive, the Sega Game Gear, as well as the Game Boy back in 1995. It was a fairly late release for every platform, as the 32-bit era was just about to kick off. I think if this released a little earlier, it likely would have went down as a classic. Give True Lies a go, it's a seriously great game. It's widely known that RoboCop 3 was a disaster of a film. Script changes, terrible storyline, the killing of Alex Murphy's partner Lewis, RoboCop being blown up by a rocket launcher, a little girl who plays a hacker character to take down Ed 209, the horrendous CGI used at the end of the film where RoboCop flies across Detroit. The film was a completely terrible film on every level, including its awful approach to water down RoboCop to an almost family film status. If you have watched many of my videos, if you grew up playing RoboCop games, really, until the recent Rogue City emerged, RoboCop truly had some terrible games, as well as a fair few good ones too. RoboCop 3 for the Amiga might look a little dated today, but this is one impressive game that ran on an Amiga 500 with no issues. Sure, there is polygons galore, but this beat the film in terms of entertainment by far in its day. RoboCop 3 also had very different games for a range of different platforms at the time, such as the Commodore 64 with its rail shooter opening level, or the side-scrolling shoot-'em-up for the SNES, which wasn't too bad, but damn, that game was a tough game, and totally let down for that reason. This Amiga version released in 1992, the ST also got the same version of this game. Ocean produced it, but really, if you had bad experiences with terrible Ocean games, this one is actually a good one from Ocean. We have two modes of play with RoboCop 3, which is the main cinematic story mode, as well as the arcade mode. We have Media Break doing the news outlet in the world of RoboCop 3, which brings a satirical commentary to this world as usual, and we also of course have a fairly early attempt at first-person shooting in its very primitive form of course. Once you get used to how to play this game by using a mouse, you could have a lot of fun with it, and we even get our visor which begins malfunctioning as enemies or the splatterpunks shoot at us. This is a very cool game and I highly recommend it, especially if you're into early days of first person shoot 'em ups. A couple years prior to Pierce Brosnan becoming James Bond or Sally Field's boyfriend in Mrs. Doubtfire, we had a major Hollywood sci-fi hit known as The Lawnmower Man, a film about virtual reality, and in many ways it was way before its time, and the CGI was absolutely groundbreaking for a film from 1992. Pierce Brosnan plays a scientist who takes an interest in experimenting with a gardener played by Jeff Fahey, who is intellectually delayed. Throughout the film, we see the scientist stimulating the gardener's brain with drugs and of course virtual reality. As the film progresses, we see the gardener's increase in intelligence, but this is where it all goes wrong. With his now superhuman abilities, he also becomes obsessed with becoming a digital being. Like I say, way before its time and very cleverly written scripts too. It kind of reminds me of that awesome Scarlett Johansson film Lucy. Oddly enough, we had a game from the film which wasn't really expected due to the content and nature of the film, but it actually works so well. If you are familiar with the development team known as the Sales Curve, they ported some awesome arcade games from the 80s, such as Silkworm and also Swiv, amongst many more to microcomputers. The game itself has two elements, a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up, as well as an absolutely well-crafted 3D simulation world. The 3D levels are likely some of the best seen on the Super Nintendo, which is of course the version that I am playing here. Lawnmower Man also released on a few other platforms including IBM PC and even the Macintosh. I borrowed this from a friend in school and this is the version that I personally think is the best of the bunch. Its soundtrack is awesome and shall we say very 90s. It's definitely one of a kind game that sticks out and this is a fairly challenging one too. We get to shoot at monkeys, blow up vans that looks a little bit like Mr. T's 18 van. We also get to battle petrol stations, collect CDs and fly through awesome virtual worlds. I totally recommend this game to anybody who likes some quirkiness in their games. You You cannot mention the 1990s without knowing that Mighty Morphin Power Rangers was a phenomenon at the time. The original Power Rangers was awesome morning viewing before school, and being such a fan of Karate Kid and general action films throughout my childhood, Power Rangers was a no-brainer. It was a cheesy camping fun, and yes, I even realised how terrible it looked at the time. I mean, Megazords battling big bad monsters around cities, like something straight out of Godzilla. It looked tacky and still does look tacky, but damn, I loved the Rangers as a kid. If you loved this as a young teenager, then you likely had a sticker book too by Saban. So after its huge success, a major motion picture came along in 1995, and I was seriously hyped for it at the time. It didn't disappoint. The main opening sequence with the Rangers jumping out of an aeroplane whilst playing the Red Hot Chili Peppers' Higher Ground was awesome. It was a visual upgrade for the cheesy series on ITV back in the day, and the Power Rangers outfits looked awesome too. Everything pretty much had an upgrade with this film. Not surprising then that the Power Rangers had several games over time, and even as recent as 2024 with Rita's Rewind. Some of the original games were fairly shoddy, although surprisingly the game based on the film is a surprisingly good beat 'em up, and likely the best of the bunch from the 90s era at least. It's pretty much a generic side-scrolling beat-em-up where we can choose to play as any one of the Rangers, or as a single player, or even in co-op mode. We have the originals here, so forget about what happens during the early 2000s with complete changes of characters. This is the proper Power Rangers. We get to fight the Putty Squad and even fight as Megazord. The game doesn't really follow much around the film itself, but it's a decent game and it gets better a few levels in. The game also had a version on the Super Nintendo, although it is different to this, and I think this is the better game. It also released for the Game Boy as well as the Sega Game Gear in '95. Why exclude the Game Boy when it also had some very awesome film game tie-in games? So of course this is Batman, and it is based on the original Tim Burton 1989 film, which totally gave the fairly dated franchise a whole new look at the time. This film was massive in its day, and the soundtrack by Prince was one of the best selling soundtracks too. I am sure I don't need to say much about the storyline, but here goes anyway. Bruce Wayne inherits money from his parents, who were shot, which turns out to be Jack Napier, aka the Joker. Bruce Wayne grows up and fights crime around Gotham City, which is being overrun by crime. The police can do very little to prevent it all, and so Bruce Wayne rises up as Batman, who takes down Jack Napier's gang, and the final showdown at the end sees Batman and the Joker, played by the awesome Jack Nicholson, battle out on a cathedral roof where Joker falls to his death. We also have a romance in this film with Vicky Vale, played by Kim Basinger. Anyways, I am sure you don't need to know the whole of this story, but I also know that a younger audience might not have seen this film before. We have plenty of games based around the original Batman film. We have the 8-bit and 16-bit computer versions by Ocean. We have a couple console releases for the Sega Mega Drive and NES, and the Game Boy also had its own version, which is a great little run and gun game. As you will see in the gameplay, it's a very basic game of course. After all, in comparison to the Steam Deck or Legion Go, the Game Boy was a seriously primitive portable, but nevertheless this is a solid game that reads in typical Nintendo old school portable style. We shoot down baddies in the Axis chemical plant whilst hitting blocks to give us weapon upgrades. And don't be fooled, this game seriously gets tough, much like his awesome NES counterpart, which is notoriously difficult. Predator 2 isn't the sequel that fans of the original 1987 Arnold Schwarzenegger film was expecting, although a nice change of scenery where we see Predator set in a city rather than the jungle, and of course we have the awesome Danny Glover as the main protagonist of the film, who was of course known previously as Mel Gibson's stressed out police officer partner in the Lethal Weapon films. A completely different dynamic that confused fans of the original undoubtedly. We are now facing an urban setting with narcotic cartels and so on. This city is a broken city. Although Predator 2 released in 1990, the film itself is actually set in the year 1997. The Predator isn't here to make friends, as it kills gang members and pretty much anyone else who he comes across. The humans are the prey after all. Predator 2, just like many other games in this video, had different versions spanning from the ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64 and Amstrad, which each had a separate game from the Sega console versions, which was more or less a rail shooting affair. The 16-bit computers also had the rail shooter style too, although looked obviously nicer. We then come onto the Sega console versions, which are again different. The Master System version was in a similar style to what you see here, but only it wasn't an isometric style game, although not a bad game nevertheless. So I believe the best version of Predator 2 was actually on the Sega Mega Drive or Sega Genesis. We don't see much of the Predator in the game, to be fair, or at least the first few levels, that is. What we do have though is a really awesome isometric shoot 'em up where we play as Harrigan from the film. We need to navigate through several levels here, rescuing hostages from the gangs on the streets while blasting away anybody else in the way. We collect narcotics or points and can even throw grenades if we collect them. Some really nice looking levels in this game, including the rooftop stage. It kind of reminds me of the game Escape from the Planet of the Robot Monsters, visually that is. It had some criticism on its release for being a relatively short game and also being fairly easy too, although we do have a difficulty setting option to increase or decrease the toughness of the game. By holding down on the fire button, we can move around while shooting in the direction that your weapon is aiming in, and it really is a fun little game to play and definitely worthy of half an hour of your time. So that's it for part 3 of the best film to game tie-ins. Like I said at the start of the video, if I have missed a particular game, then it's likely in the other parts of the video. There will be another video in this little series to come along. Let us know in the comment section if you actually enjoyed any of these games back in the day. Is there actually a game in this list where you don't necessarily agree with me that it was a good game? Anyways, until next video comes, thanks for watching.
Whoa!